We have a gentleman by the name of Robert J. Teitelbaum joining us from California today on Studio 411. He has co-authored with Cindy L. Carter a book called Frogs and Snails and Mobster Tales, Growing Up in Al Capone's Shadow. And initially when you see that, you think, oh, it's going to be about mobsters and all sorts of stuff to do with Chicago and New York. And it is in some ways, but it also is a telling story about the really the hellacious times that Robert and his siblings growing up in California. While their parents, who were lawyers for the Capone family and the Capone mob, kind of, I guess, had to do their thing, and the kids kind of had to survive on their own. And Robert is here joining us from California. Robert, welcome to Studio 411. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Larry.
One thing before we start, I had to mention this little blurb here. We had a something in the paper recently. It was out of the Boston area. I thought you might get a kick out of. Al Capone, apparently a song that he wrote and a pocket watch fetched $103,000 at auction recently. The Boston-based RR Auction Company said that a diamond watch that belonged to Al Capone fetched over $84,000 at an auction recently in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I don't know if you knew this, but I guess Capone fancied himself a songwriter. A handwritten musical composition by Mr. Capone went for $18,750. And the piece was called Humoresque. And I don't know, that seems a little not fitting title for Mr. Capone in his life, would you say?
No, actually, he was probably better with a baseball bat.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll forego that at this point. But anyway, I thought you'd get a kick out of that. That obviously after all these years,
really good information.
Someone beside Geraldo actually stumbled on something that did belong to Mr. Capone. Tell me, the book Frogs and Snails and Mobster Tales, Growing Up in Al Capone's Shadow, what after all these years, and I think as the folks will realize, as I said in the intro, what you and your siblings went through. What, after all these years, what is part of the kind of catharsis or the therapeutic phase of your life that you decided to sit down and put pen and paper to this story?
Absolutely, because I had a very horrific childhood. From the age of 4 until 14, I was mentally, physically, and sexually abused, along with my sisters, by our bodyguard.
And this took place primarily in the California area after you and your mom had moved to from the Chicago area, correct?
In 46, things got too hot, so we moved to a place where it was a cool zone, so to speak. Palm Springs through the Coachella Valley was a no-kill zone for any of the 5 outfits.
There you go.
So we moved to a place that was safe.
The book is about finding hope, coming to terms with what you've been through, making peace, healing, and moving forward, which it seems like you have done to a large degree. And of course, moving forward using your inner strength and at this point in your life, I think, trying to help others. Again, some of the websites, but we'll get into a little bit later on. Robert is a co-chair of Creative Change Conferences, in addition to being a Screen Actors Guild actor and an author, as we mentioned, longtime casting director, primarily for Universal Studios, among others. Again, who's certainly overcome, again, what would basically be called trauma, abuse, and has assisted in more recent years in trying to help others recover from their stories, which again, childhood sexual abuse, 39 million survivors last, I understand, in the United States alone, a frightening statistic.
Well, the actual numbers, and we find these numbers to be true from going around the country, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 4 boys will be sexually abused by the age of 18. And those are just the reported numbers.
Now, in your research while putting the book together, and of course the endeavors you're involved with, are there stereotypes on the types of abuse by gender? I know there was something in the book that talked a little bit about that. If you want to share some of that with us.
Actually, it's as far as stereotypes. No, I don't. I don't seem to remember writing that.
Basically, there was a part in there that talked about, in other words, that sometimes if there's someone who is later to come out as being gay, homosexual, lesbian, there seems to be, in other words, a false perception that, well, they were that way because of this, and it wasn't the abuse, or the abuse led to that. I mean, are these things in your experiences, people you've dealt with, is any of that have any validity, or is it just something that kind of people assume is the norm?
Well, a lot of even MFTs and people who are psychologists will say that if it wasn't for gay men, there wouldn't be any abuse on boys, and that is truly BS. The abuse is not for sex. The abuse is for control and power over a victim.
Share a little bit about, and again, there's so many avenues to go down, but we'll stay with obviously 1946 at this point. You were just a baby, one of what, the fourth of,
and I was already taught to read and write, and I knew colors and I knew my math. And it's when you become a victim of abuse. Let's put it this way. The pain and the shame is so terrible that you stuff it. And then when you stuff feelings for so many years, it comes out in rage, and it comes out terribly in the use of drugs and alcohol and many, many other addictions. I mean, it's a hard thing to explain, and everybody, they always say, "Oh, gee, I know how you feel." That's the worst thing you could ever tell an abuse victim,
right?
Because you do not know how they feel.
You talk about in the book about, again, basically your scenario, and I'm sure so many others this could apply to. Basically, innocent children caught up in the middle of extraordinary chaos.
You bet. You bet. We have groups that we do. We have over 50 men that we see probably every 2 weeks. And every one of their stories, when we have a new man in the group, they will always say the same thing. I thought I was the only person that this happened to. And it's good to know that you were not the only one. Because I thought the same way until I started going to the groups that Carol and we did start, because I was kind of out of control.
Right. And Carol being your wife of over 50 years, Carol Teitelbaum, again, who you work with quite I was going to say certainly seriously, but quite together on many of these projects. Well, I digress for a minute. We look at a shot here of your dad. Tell us a little bit about your dad, who, of course, was counsel for Al Capone, amongst others.
Yes, many others. My father was born in 1906. He was born about 6 blocks away from Ben. My father had a total recall on what he could read. If he would read something, he could read it back to you verbatim 30, 40 years ago, because he used to do it out of his law books. And that's what made him a great lawyer, because my mother would give him the research that she would do, and my father could go to court and win cases without even trying, without even bringing a briefcase.
Wow.
It was absolutely amazing. He also spoke 7 languages fluently. And
now, obviously, working as counsel to so many folks, will say potentially ill repute, again, consumed a lot of his time and certainly took time away from the family. And we'll get back to him throughout the interview. We're also looking here at a shot of your lovely mother, Esther, who frankly astonished me because she just seems like a remarkable lawyer in her own right. And again, obviously that's what drew them together. But she really was, when they worked together on cases, she really was quite the right-hand person to your dad.
She was the brains of the operation, tell you the truth. My mama, she was the clerk to the dean at John Marshall Law School. The first year. The second year, she was introduced to the Illinois Supreme Court, and she clerked there for on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the next 3 years. Graduated law school, and she started boxing at an early age, and she was really good at boxing, and she used her skill in boxing in being a research lawyer. She would turn over every stone. She would use, a right jab to make sure that every I and T were crossed, the I's dotted and the T's crossed. She really knew her stuff, and they never lost a case. See, they were not Al Capone's tax attorneys. My mama always said that if she was Al's tax attorney, he would have never gone to jail because he took foolish advice from Mattingly, Ahern, and also Fink. They were great lawyers, but Mattingly did a very bad thing by writing an admission that Capone would accept a guilty plea before the court even made an offer. My mother was livid about that. But of course, that's my mom talking, saying that if she was his lawyer, he wouldn't have gone to jail. But yes, Mama did. She wasn't able to ever control my father. She loved him dearly, and my father was a womanizer. And he was always over at Sheeny Rose's, and that was in Cicero. And he would go there with Ralph Capone because they were good buddies. And, they were for many, many, many years. I have letters between them, so these are facts. And also the FOIA list, the federal. The list that the FBI gives out after 50 years.
Interesting. Robert J. Teitelbaum joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. The book, Frogs and Snails and Mobster Tales, Growing Up in Al Capone's Shadow. Back to your mom for a second. As learned and as well-schooled and intelligent as she was, to get back to family life, I know that there was a part in the book where I got the impression she didn't necessarily, because she liked what she was doing, was too keen on initially starting a family, but obviously one she did, probably at your dad's urging. But then once you guys were in California and these atrocities started happening, again, kind of fill us in without giving too much away. Your mom just seemed to almost like zone out. I mean, was she was she not well? Was she just incapable of seeing that obviously things were going on around her that were impacting her children? Well,
people were trying to kill my father. My mother didn't want to leave. She didn't ever want to go to this desert. But my father had friends down here, and he bought the Loveless Ranch. And that was made for Franklin Roosevelt, but he passed before he got to it. So we wound up in Palm Springs first, and then at the Loveless Ranch, which was quite a place. My little sister died in 1949. My father had made a huge bet on some horses, and he made a lot of money. And he took Louis Romano with him and with my mom, and they went across country in '49. and it took them 2.5 months to collect all the money from the bookies. The reason why they brought Louis Romano with them, because everybody was afraid of Louis. He was also at one time the head of the Bartenders Union. So they went out, and my little sister died in 1949 in California. It was a terrific, in fact, the whole United States. There was a terrible bird flu, and it's easy to look it up. It really hit the Coachella Valley very bad, and everybody at our ranch was sick. And my parents weren't there, and my little sister died of pneumonia from the bird flu.
Gotcha.
At that time, my mother just kind of gave up. She would, I had, at the time, we were 5, and then all of a sudden we were 4, and her little baby daughter, who was 13 months younger than I was, and she died at 13 months. She just gave up. She got tired of looking the other way at my father's indiscretions. My father would rather rather be in Vegas or someplace else gambling and womanizing rather than being at home. We would start seeing him only about 4 weeks a year, sometimes start of the year and sometimes at the end. And for a while, until 1954, from 49 to 54, we would spend 6 weeks at the Beverly Hills Hotel on Sunset. And then when you go back, so we wouldn't see my pop too much. I had no father image to be a father myself, and I'm really sorry about that, because I thought I was a good father, but I turned out, we never want to turn into our parents, but sometimes we do.
Now, your dad, and again, this is spelled out pretty clearly in the book, your dad wound up actually having another family, correct me if I'm wrong, an additional 4, which would be to use step-siblings, with a woman that obviously it seemed like he was spending more time with them, based out of Chicago and or New York, and then later in California. Again, this must have been something that, on top of everything else that you and your siblings went through, must have then even compounded, the confusion going on in your own minds.
Well, I'm close with the second family, and always have been since I came out of the Marine Corps. But the situation is that I just gave the book to my brother, and he is 11 years younger than me, and he's my half brother.
Yes.
He read the book. He said, "I always thought we had it bad. I'm shocked that you survived."
And now he thought he had it bad only in the context, because again, having read the book, why was that? Because of hardships, or did they go through any kind of abuse similar to what you and your natural siblings went through?
Well, his mom was an alcoholic, and we used to chase him around the house with a knife, and it was chaos there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't very good. My father was having a fight with Robert Kennedy, and wound up in front of the Senate Racket Committees in 54, 55. He went to jail in 72, and the family then was still together. But his second wife, killed herself when she turned 49 because she didn't want to be 49.
Wow.
And that really put a hardship on the other kids. But they didn't, I always thought that they were lucky that they weren't in the same concentration camp that me, my sisters, and my other brother was in. Now,
your older brother, on your mom's side, your natural brother, the oldest of the group, I'm blanking, Albert was his name?
Yes.
Okay. Now, all your siblings, the first half, we'll call them, they're all still with us as of this taping, correct? Other than your baby sister.
Right. My oldest brother is turning 80, and he has Alzheimer's. And
Okay.
he read the book, and he doesn't realize that I let a cat out of the bag. My brother, when he was 14, started molesting my sisters and myself, and it wasn't a kind thing. It wasn't a loving thing, I can assure you. And I just It's hard because I can't confront him. I tried to, me and my sisters and I, we tried to confront him in the 80s. And at that point, he just moved away to New York and never came back. And we never really had too much anything with him.
Right.
Sisters were terribly abused by also by the bodyguard. Mm-hmm.
And now, this also, at which point I got the feeling during the 80s when you tried discussing it with Albert, your mom, I mean, I almost got the feeling like she was like almost totally in denial that all these atrocities happened.
Absolutely, because she wasn't there to witness them. She was in her room. She'd come out to eat. If I was listening to the Indianapolis 500, she'd come out and sit with me. Or if there was a boxing match and somebody that she really liked, she would come out and sit with me. But other than that, I never got the kisses to go to school. I never got the hugs to say goodnight. She was terribly wounded, and she never wanted kids because she had 9 brothers and sisters, and she was third in line. So she raised 6 of them. While she was growing up and going to school and getting straight A's, and she was done with family. She didn't want kids. Not at all. Yeah. And that's a hard thing for me to say. I'm not an actor.
Well, even your baby sister at that point in the book, your parents, in my opinion, these are my words, not the books, were basically estranged. And frankly, I was like sitting there saying, wait a minute, where did this child come from? Obviously, I know where it came from, but I was just like, I guess I said it only takes once, but I mean, I couldn't believe that at that point they were having another child, because clearly the marriage, in my opinion, was irretrievably, say that 3 times, broken. And so again, it just, to me, it almost like she was functioning like in a depression the rest of that time.
Okay, I'll let you in on a secret. When my pop would come out for 2 weeks, usually my mom and pop would fight after 2 or 3 days, and he'd leave in 4 or 5. He'd just jump in the limo and go to LA, get on the plane, go back to Chicago. But while they were at home together, no matter how much they were fighting, they were still sleeping together.
Yeah, yeah.
And here's another thing. Linda was born because of the 6 weeks that we spent at the hotel in
Beverly Hills. Yeah, yeah.
But here's what it used to be. Pop would come home and he'd be sleeping with Mom, and us kids would all say, gee, Pop is coming back. He's going to stay. But he didn't. So he would leave and go to Beverly Hills to the second family. So he was cheating on the second family with the first family. Yeah. And then going home and cheating on the on the first family with the second.
Right.
Family. It was worse, and this went on for years, all the way until 1958. That's when my mom finally realized what she was doing, and she started getting back on her feet. She became a lawyer again in '64, and she died at 90. And she died, actually, it was in 1995 she passed. So she had a very good career working for a major firm in Westwood, and she was the go-to lady to win cases.
So that's good. That's good to hear, because again, it kind of doesn't talk about it as much as I know I would have liked, And I thought, well, when the screenplay for the movie is written, obviously we'll include some of that. But again, it's just shocking to me. Understandably, I get it. Is that she in those mid '80s was in such denial, because your brother, and again, we've talked a little bit about this off air. Your brother doesn't come out very good at all. I hope you know that.
Oh, I know.
Your sister's very sympathetic.
And forgive him. Yeah. And it's a hard thing to do. My sister Celeste also has Alzheimer's.
Wow.
She is 76. She started writing her book, and every page, from page 1 to page, I think, 56, it said it was kind of like a daily journal. She says, I was raped again. I was molested again. And this went on all these pages, and she gave me the book, and I copied it. I do have it. It was a terrible experience for her. It went on for her a little bit longer than us because she was older. And when she was 19, she was in terrible shape. She was working the streets in LA. She got married 3 or 4 times. She has 2 kids. Last time I visited her, I looked at the log at the residence where she's at, where there's about 300 people, and her kids hadn't visited her in almost a year.
Wow.
And it's very sad. I love my sister. My sister Ann is very close to me, and we talk every day. Ann was the angriest woman in the world. I mean, really upset, and rightfully so. And when I gave her my book, a copy before we published, she called me back in about 6 weeks, and she was crying, and she told me, I never saw it in black and white. And now I understand what I went through, because no one ever sat me down and showed me. And the book helped her. And if it never helped any other person, I'm proud to have written this book because of her. And I'm really also very proud of Cindy Carter. Dr. Cindy Carter is the provost at Fresno Pacifica, and she has been my friend since '94. And I was about a year into the book, and she was doing one of our conferences. In fact, she does all our conferences with Creative Change, the It Happens to Boys conferences. And she was at our house. And she realized I was trouble. I was working on the script, and she said, "What happened?" I said, "Well, I just can't finish things." And she said, "Why is that?" And I told her, I said, I could remember all this, but I cannot finish it because it's too hard on me. And she said, "Well, when friends are needed, friends come." And we spent the next year and a half on Facebook and Skype. We would every day. We did anywhere from an hour to 3 hours working on this to finish it.
Robert J. Teitelbaum joining us for a riveting Studio 411 here today. And a quote from the back of the book here. Dave Pelzer, #1 New York Times author of A Child Called It, a recipient of the National Jefferson Award, quote, Robert has dedicated his life to helping those in extreme need. Behind the veil of frogs and snails and mobster tales is a family who was steeped in deceit, crime, and abuse. So this is a critical account of childhood pain. Even more importantly, it brings courage and support to many survivors. Again, Robert J. Teitelbaum, as well as Dr. Cindy L. Carter, co-author, and obviously a person that helped bring out the best and, may I say, probably the worst in terms of the stories, but again, that needed to be told. I know from our conversations leading up to today's interview, you, along with your wife and other assorted cohorts who I'm sure help you in your endeavors, especially with Creative Change conferences, you must be a very busy man in trying to get the word out to so many folks that have undergone their own issues.
Mm-hmm. I don't know the exact count, but people tell us that of the thousands of people that we've seen, that many people have gotten help at our conference in Pasadena and also in Long Beach. That was 3 conferences ago. Jerry Moe got up. He's for 18 years has been the head of the children's department at Hazleton Betty Ford, and he said after hearing 6 of us tell our stories. He asked people, because we do a T-shirt thing of people showing their pain, adults showing their pain from being molested as a child. and he asked the audience. There was over, I think, 230 people in one, over 200. There's always over 200. To anybody in the audience that would come up and hold up a T-shirt, because this is their story too. A third of the audience each time showed up. A third out of 200.
Wow.
Must tell you that there are a lot more people that this affects than just the reported numbers.
Sure.
And God bless Dave Pelzer. He's a great man. I spent 5 months with him writing the screenplay for A Child Called It. And because of his courage and his mentoring is the reason why I wrote my book.
You mentioned, too, Jerry Moe, National Director of Children's Programs at the Betty Ford Center. He, of course, wrote the foreword to the book, and again, very well written. And again, I wanted to throw that out because I had it written in my notes that that certainly led me into the rest of what I was about to experience. We just had a shot, but I think you actually have the evidence on you. Tell the folks the story about when you were born. Your cufflinks are interesting to say the least, Robert. Tell us a little bit about those.
I was born September 22nd, 1945. My father called Ralph Capone and told him about me being born. He called Al. Al had a pair of cufflinks made for me. In the middle of November of 45, Ralph went to Florida to pick him up at his Palm Beach home. And he brought him back to Chicago to see his doctors and, of course, to see our family, because that's one of the things. They were close. If you look at the pictures of my father and Capone, you will realize that they look like brothers. And when they're all together, it's really amazing. But here's the situation. He showed up to our house for dinner, and he asked to see me, and my mother went and got me from one of the caretakers, brought me out and gave him to my mother and Al. And this is what he made. I don't know if you can see it well, but I have both of them. I've only worn them twice. I wore them at something when I was around 6 years old. I wore them at the Annenberg on last November 14th. I believe I had 240 people that came to hear me talk and be interviewed by Bruce Fessier, the editor of the Desert Sun, because he had also done a thing about the mob-free area in the Coachella Valley. So what he did was he asked me if, to end the front page articles that he did with what's going on at why my parents went to the Loveless Ranch and why it was a free zone and why people weren't shooting at my pop here. But yes, these are them. They're very, very well made. If you look sideways, I don't know if you can get in close enough. And let me see if I can do this. You can see that the cylinder turns, and if you can see into it, you can see that there are holes for bullets. It was a very well-made piece of jewelry.
Something every newborn baby boy is in need of. But I must tell you, we're flattered that you wore them tonight to be here with us on Studio 411. And I've heard of meet and greet after an event like the one you did. They must have wanted to shake your hand and admire those cufflinks for sure.
Absolutely. The Desert Sun took pictures of it, and so did the local TV channels. They came over, and they also wanted to film it. And when I'm done, I will put them back in the safety deposit box at the bank, because that's where they belong. They do not belong on a child. It was one of the worst initiation gifts that anybody could ever have.
I've heard of baptism under fire, but that's a bit ridiculous. But anyway, I guess there was some thought. I don't know. Again, everybody to each his own. When it comes to gift giving, some are good and some are not necessarily as good. Robert J. Teitelbaum joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. When we think of gangsters and mobsters of the 20th century, many times we think of them, especially from the old Edward G. Robinson movies, as always being Italian, although, frankly, there were many, as you refer to them, tough Jews that were as very much influential in the activities going on from the early 1900s, especially through the late 50s and even into the 70s and 80s, especially in the New York and Chicago area. That time when your dad was an attorney for these people, in some ways, I think, unfortunately, because you were just a boy, only scratches at the surface. It's too bad your mom didn't make some notes herself and put a book together herself.
That's true, but my father and mother, even though they were separated when Carol and I got married, would come over to my house a lot separately, and they would tell stories over and over ad nauseum. In fact, to a point that they would start to tell a story, and I'd look at my wife, and she would start mouthing what they were going to say. And that's why I know about all these guys. I met many of them. I am not. They're not good role models, I can assure you. But I learned an awful lot for them, and I did admire them for a while. Ben Siegel was at our house, and we were told not to bother him because he was there with Virginia Hill and stayed in our pool house. And
we've got a shot here of Ben Siegel, I believe. Is that your mom and your two baby sisters there, or older sisters?
That's Tony Arcado.
Oh, Tony Arcado. Okay.
That's a bad boy.
Uh-oh.
He was called Joe Batters or the Big Tuna.
Wow. There you go.
He was one of he was kind of like Louis Romano at the time, except this guy took control of the after Frankie Nitti killed himself. Frankie went to jail for 18 months. He got out, and they made him the head of the outfit. And then after a couple of years, they kind of moved him into retirement. And then in 43 or 44, he was indicted along with 14 other members. And he was told by his attorney, he didn't accept my parents as attorneys, but he told his attorney, he hired a different attorney. The attorney told him he was going to get 5 years. He went to the railroad tracks and shot himself in the head. All the other 14 guys were totally set free. All the indictments were torn up, and nobody ever was charged again. And that's definitely because of my mother and my father.
Wow. And I think of it as a boy, and actually it was a little before my time, but I got to see it in reruns later on. A very famous show, late 50s, early 60s, The Untouchables. And there was, of course, a Frank Nitti, which growing up we thought it was a fictitious character. Now, obviously, we know that it was based on a real person, and of course, all the well-known mobsters of the day. Although by the time that show was produced, most of them were deceased, such as Mr. Capone. Now, Al died in prison, correct?
No, he only served 6 years and 7 months. He was given 12 years in prison. He was supposed to get 11 years at Alcatraz in the big house, and then another year in San Pedro at whatever the name. I can't even think of the federal prison there for the misdemeanors. My parents promised they would get him out. They got him out in 6 years and 4 months. He never did that. He died in 1947.
Wow.
He 47, just before, after Ben Siegel was murdered.
We've got a shot here of your dad, another one that made the cover or the inside pages. It looks like the cover of Life magazine. Tell us a little bit about it. Looks like your dad's taking a polygraph test?
Yeah, he always could pass those. He understood. He was a smart man. and he understood that he could always pass a polygraph. You have another picture there. I don't know if you have it, but it shows Frank Nitti and Al Capone, my father, by a car. I don't know if you have that one.
Let's see. We'll look for it, see if we can dig it up. But no, okay. But yeah, but this one here, pretty impressive. Now you say he could pass a polygraph test. I mean, so you're saying that the lie detector tests are flawed?
Yeah, of course they're flawed. If you can slow your heart rate down and be able to control it, if you can slow your breathing down and control it, you can pass a polygraph, and that's what he did.
Now, a paternal great uncle of yours, Harry Teitelbaum, was part of the famous Murderers, Inc. Group of assassins. This was what, in the early part of the 20th century?
That picture is from 1931. They were arrested. Those 5 guys were arrested for the murder of the boss of all bosses. And they were picked up by the police and brought in and questioned, and they never went to trial. They were released for lack of evidence. That included Uncle Harry.
Amazing. Now, you spoke earlier about your dad, and of course, did you ever, like during the 60s? Oh, the other photo we're showing of your dad here, you had mentioned earlier, I guess, was he was being investigated or questioned by this is pre-Attorney General, I believe, Robert Kennedy, and some commission. Yeah, yeah.
They didn't get along well. My father got up in his face. He told him, Kennedy pulled him aside after they let my father out, and he says, I see you're still hiding behind the Fifth Amendment. My father said, yeah, it's to save myself from rats like you. And he told him that if he called him again, that he would not talk about anything he asked, but he would talk about his father. Because my father always said this, and he told this to Kennedy. I believe it's in the book, The Greenfeld Jungle. I'm not really sure, but I saw it in the book, one of the books, many, many years ago. It was his father. My father told him that his father, in his worst years, was worse than Capone in his best years.
So this would be the Papa Joe Kennedy, of course, who was known as a bootlegger in the early days, later was ambassador to Great Britain, which was rather comical. And of course, so the story goes, aided his son in getting elected, John, that is, back in 1960. So the story goes. So
right.
quite an adventurous man in his own right. You bring up in the book a Dr. Pauly, again, who saw many of these so-called injuries that at least that you were impacted with from the beatings and different mishaps that occurred at the at the hands of the perpetrator that was taunting you and your siblings. Do you think that same scenario played out in today's time? That these kind of things, you even had a teacher and a principal at one point in your school that saw that there were injuries, and yet nobody did anything.
6th grade. I remember the teacher. It was the first man teacher I had. Everybody else was women, and I'll bring it back just a little bit. In 5th grade, I got run over by a 55 Buick on my brother's bike, and I got the handlebar of my bike went through my upper thigh. Dr. Pauly and surgeons took care of me, and I healed. When I was able to go back to school, I was back to school one day, and when I came home, I took a terrible beating for being on my brother's bike. That's the kind of things that would happen. And yes, Dr. Pauly saw a lot of things. I think everybody was afraid of my parents. I mean, here are mobsters at our house. Not only mobsters, but Governor Knight and senators would come, and anybody ever got elected a mayor in this town, anywhere in the Coachella Valley, from Indio to Palm Springs, they would always throw the party at the great Loveless Ranch, a place that was made for a president, that he died before he got there, and it was too damn hot for Eleanor. And my father bought it from, Walter Kirshner. Paid him $125,000, wrote him a check the day he walked in. My mother loved the place because that way 50 of our relatives could come and stay with us during the summers, during the good times. But they were never good times after I was 4 years old.
Right. Ironic, again, the name of the ranch, was it named after something that, or someone, Loveless? What was the connotation for the naming that ranch?
Ever since I can remember, it was always called the Loveless Ranch. And I don't know if it ever belonged to anybody named Loveless, or Walter Kirshner bought it as a piece of property. Walter Kirshner was with FDR during every one of his campaigns from the first time. And they were very good friends. He owned the May companies and also many different places all over the country, big department stores. So he was very close, and he was also from Chicago. He was one of my father's clients, which I forgot to put him in the Foley list. But the truth he asked FDR if he could build him a house in Palm Springs so he could be there instead of retiring in cold New York in the Valkill and Hyde Park. He said, "No, I don't want to be seen there because I don't want to be shown being carried in and out of my car." He says, "I need a place that is secure." So Kirshner took it upon himself to build the Loveless Ranch, a 10-acre ranch, a 3-acre compound with 11-foot high walls. Needless to say, I used to think that they were to keep people out, but it was really to keep me in. But it was a show place. It had a huge home. It had a pool house that was bigger than most people's houses. It had a 5-room Secret Service house. It had so much that was so beautiful and at the same time so deadly.
No doubt, no doubt. And as you said, it definitely turned in from a paradise to almost like a prison in its own way for you and your siblings.
I got to a point that I felt if I was getting beaten every day, I might as well act out and do something to be beaten for.
Right. Robert J. Teitelbaum joining us in the remaining moments here on Studio 411. The book Frogs and Snails and Mobster Tales, Growing Up in Al Capone's Shadow, co-written with Dr. Cindy L. Carter. Again, just in the remaining couple of minutes we have here, another thing I got while I was reading the book was, I know she went back into active work later on in the 60s. But during that time when the money was running tight, your dad was experiencing, some charges that eventually, years later, landed him in prison for a few years. Why was your mother not able to supplement the lost income? Was it just because of the state she was in, or your dad telling her, "Look, I don't want you to go to work"? I mean, at that point, he wasn't even really in the picture.
Well, he was always somehow in the picture because he would be in trouble and he'd be in tax trouble. My mom would write a writ and get it put off for 2 or 3 years. My mom was really good at confusing other attorneys, especially district attorneys and prosecuting attorneys. That is why she did so well. But the truth of it was not much she just wasn't able to work when we moved to Beverly Hills in '58 into our grandparents' house that my mom bought for them many years before. We had to move in with the grandparents. She started looking but never did, and when she got discouraged, and in '64, my wife was pregnant with our first child, and she asked my mom, would she sub for her while she was taking a pregnancy leave so she wouldn't lose her job. And when the attorney realized that they had an attorney with a license to practice in front of the Supreme Court, the Illinois Supreme Court, Illinois, and California, they jumped, and they really, it was really good for my mom. I admire my mother. When she died, she still had my baby sister's clothes. and we buried him with her 50 feet away from Ben Siegel and 100 feet away from my sister Linda.
Yeah, and I recall it in the book that it talked that there were no such mementos of your dad's in there. So obviously very telling in many ways, but more importantly, the shock and the trauma that caused your mom by losing her youngest child at such a young age.
And after having children when she really didn't want them.
Exactly. In the couple of minutes we have left, again, the book, words fail me. I mean, it's something that has to be, no pun intended, experienced. I found myself almost like, at times, feeling like I was reading a book the size of War and Peace, because you got, and I mean this as a compliment, you got like pulled into this to the point where you really just couldn't believe what you were reading. And obviously because you lived it. But I mean, what does this story, when folks who have had their own issues, give us in a half a minute or so, what does this book do for others that have had their own problems?
When they read the book, they now have a voice. They can come out and tell other people, and they can go get some help. Just like Dave Pelzer. It helps more people than you can ever imagine, because they have to understand it's not just them that this happened to. This happens to so many millions of people in our country that it's just it's hard to fathom.
We've got a quote to end our segment here with Robert from John Lee, author of The Flying Boy and the Half-Lived Life. Quote, "This is a wonderfully written account of one man's story about surviving mobsters, monsters, and haunting memories of abuse and shame." Mr. Lee further quotes, "Read on, and this book will provide important life-changing lessons about resilience, recovery, and release from those who can torture wounded souls." Mr. Lee closes his comment by saying, quote, "I highly recommend this book." That again from John Lee, author, best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, if I recall. Robert, again, so much more to discuss. We look forward to having you on at some point in time to continue the discussion, what you and your wife and your organizations are up to. Again, 2 websites for more information, Frogs and Snails and mobstertales.com. And also the most important one, I think, creativechangeconferences.com for more information. Robert, again, thank you for joining us, and I appreciate you taking us a few moments to join us here on Studio 411.
Thank you, Larry. I really appreciate the time.
Our pleasure. Hang in there for a second, and we thank you for joining us on this episode of Studio 411. We look forward to visiting with you again real soon. For now, have a great day.